Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today on reopening considerations. I want to apologize for the short notice of the webinar. I know you guys are out there preparing right now to reopen, and we wanted to make sure you had all the knowledge necessary to do that successfully. We are delighted to be joined today by Michael Sullivan, Mark Enriquez, and Sarah Tucker of Waivers Dickinson. You'll learn here soon that WBD is holding a series of getting back to work webinars over the next few weeks. First one being this Friday. We'll be sure to get information out to all HFA members on how they can attend those for free. Today, however, it's going to be HFA focused, industry focused. This is your opportunity to ask questions. There's a chat, a Q&A function on your right hand of your screen where you can type in questions. We'll be sure to answer all those, try to put those into an FAQ form so that all the members can have their questions answered. But please take this opportunity to ask specific questions that you're experiencing right now as you go through the reopening process. So let me turn it over to Mark and Sarah and Michael.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Michael Sullivan. If my video is not working, I'll tell you the storm's going through Atlanta right now, and it may be interrupting us. Thank you for joining us. I hope all of you are safe and healthy. Over the last several weeks, I've read articles about people who have picked up new habits and hobbies while they're dealing with the shelter at home, looking for things to do. I have found it the opposite to be true, that the world's become more hectic and time's become more precious. I suspect that's true for all of you too. So we appreciate you spending that time here today. We think we'll have some information that will be beneficial for you and will lead you to get some information you need as you try to reopen your businesses. Over the last several weeks, we've all been faced with a variety and a large volume of federal, state, local regulation, and then been bombarded with a bundle of experts who seem to come out of the woodwork to tell us what it all means. And then all of that seemed to change daily. Early in the process, Womble put together a team to digest this information and distill it down into form and in a manner that is actually useful to businesses. Mark Enriquez, my partner, is the head of that team, and our partner Sarah Tucker is an important part, having deep experience in the regulatory world. Mark and Sarah will going to give you about 30 minutes today on some of the issues that will be facing businesses like yours as you begin the reopening process, as the economy starts coming back up. And as Andy said, there will be follow-up seminars that we'd invite you to participate in. Questions can come in through the WebEx, typing the questions on the right-hand side as Andy discussed. If for some reason we don't get to any of your questions, we'll be happy as an extension of the webinar to have a call with you afterwards. And also, and just a caution that I mention often when I speak to this group, if you have questions that deal with facts unique and particular to your businesses, those are probably best done one-on-one in a phone call after the webinar. So we'll be very happy to have Sarah, Mark, or whatever appropriate member of our team's available to handle those questions. So I would encourage you to have questions about general issues that we're all facing and deal with the specific business questions for your particular business on a one-on-one basis. With that, let me toss it over to Mark and Sarah to begin our program. Mark?
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate it. As Michael mentioned, I'm co-chair of the COVID-19 task force here at the firm, and we've put a lot of information together, much of which you can find at our website, Waivers Dickinson. But we are doing a series of webinars specifically related to the return to work. Sarah Tucker, who's going to be joining me today, is also going to be doing one of those webinars, and we've got several others coming, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. We do, so in some ways this is an appetizer course where you're going to get a sense of some of the issues, and if you're interested, some of those other webinars that will be an hour long each can dive into some more details. But let's jump in and talk a little bit about returning to work. This is potentially an exciting time for us where businesses are finally being able to reopen, many of which have been closed, for many weeks. But it's also a time of a lot of caution where I think businesses are trying to decide both, do we reopen? And if so, how do we do it? What are some of the considerations that we need to address in terms of the workplace, in terms of interacting with employees? And Sarah and I are going to touch on some of those issues. And looking over the registration list for this group, I'm excited. We've got folks in a number of different states, not just in North Carolina where I am, but also around the country, from California to Michigan, Louisiana, Georgia, a number of places. So welcome to all of you. I think I do want to start by noting that each state is different. Governor Cooper's, indicated he'll do a phase 1 opening starting May 8th, but then a series after that. But each state is doing things a little differently. South Carolina has expressly allowed furniture stores reopen. Sarah's in our Georgia office. You want to just comment, Sarah, and welcome to the webinar and talk to us a little bit about Georgia as well.
Sure. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Mark, are you hearing me okay?
I hear you clear, loud and clear, Sarah. Great.
I had a little bit of trouble with my video at first, which apparently was the fact that I did not have my shutter open on my laptop camera. So I'm super tech advanced, as you can tell, but I'm here.
You're looking good.
Thanks for giving me an excuse to put on some makeup today. In Georgia, the governor has rolled out some phased orders for reopening businesses, as I'm sure you've seen in the news. In terms of furniture stores, basically they can reopen, but it's just minimum basic operations. So there are specific requirements for safety and procedures which need to be followed, which are spelled out on the government website if you want to take a look at those. But reopening is definitely something that's happening right now in Georgia. So it's a little bit more lax than some of the other states we're seeing, which like California and Louisiana that are next on the list.
Right. Yeah, and those two right now have not indicated any immediate reopen plans that I'm aware of. And obviously both California and Louisiana were hard hit in some areas with COVID, so they may be a little slower to update. I know some of you have stores in many states or almost all the states. We've got some big furniture companies on the line. We have created a separate website. You can also reach it through our own website called stateclosures.com. You can go there, you can get a map of all 50 states and click on it and see what the closure order is. And it's been interesting as someone that's helped some of the participation, but I'm not in charge of the project. The map has evolved. Gray means there's no closure order. We still have, I think, 5 or 6 states. When we started, I think we had New York, and Maine were yellow, indicating and they had closed, and California joined almost immediately. And over the last 3 weeks, the state has gone from gray, meaning no orders, to almost entirely yellow with orders. Now it's turning green as some states like Georgia are reopening under certain conditions. And I expect we'll now see another 6-week period where the map goes from yellow to green as more and more states open in full or in part. But it's a great resource. It is not down to the local level. So I mention that just because, as many of you probably know, some counties have different restrictions. So for example, in Charlotte, where I am, we have a local shelter-in-place ordinance that's a little different than the North Carolina statewide one. And you actually, under North Carolina, have to follow whichever is more restrictive in those areas. So that is important, particularly if your stores are located in large cities. You may need to check on what the local ordinance is as well as the statewide ordinance. But you can find all those statewide orders at that website. I think the other 2 things I'd mention before we start getting into the logistics of reopening are, first of all, to reopen, you're going to want to make sure that both your customers know what's happening, that you've told them that you're going to reopen or you're ready to reopen, and think about suppliers and potential issues. So particularly for those of you that are, doing retail, make sure you've got, the product lined up and all the other pieces in that component. And if you're the plant side, because I think we have both manufacturers and retailers, and some of you do both on the call, if you're going to be reopening, you want to make sure you've got the supplies that you need and your suppliers lined up so that the plant can actually operate. And we've had other clients that are really struggling with that aspect. They think they're ready, but key components are delayed because their suppliers are shut down and not ready. And so it's kind of pointless to bring everybody in and get the plant running only to shut it down after 6 hours because you're missing an essential component. So I think double checking that, is important because supply chains have been disrupted across the number. The last point I'd mention, because I got asked this question yesterday by a client, is do we have to open when the governor says we're open? And the answer is definitely not. These are permissive openings. If you decide you're not ready, or you need more time to get ready, or your employees are too nervous, or you don't think you're going to have the demand right away, you can delay that opening to a time that makes sense for you. The only real caveat is, obviously, if some of you have leased spaces in shopping centers or other stuff, you may have leases that require operation, although I've experienced most landlords have been pretty lenient on hours of operation type requirements during the COVID crisis. Our advice is open when you're ready. Don't feel pressure to open just because you've got the green light. And again, many of you are ready and chomping at the bit, but you don't have to open on the exact day that you're first allowed to open. You can open when you're comfortable. Anything you want to add there, Sarah?
Well, I'll talk about it a little bit when we get to the liability section, I think, but there will be some liability considerations, I think, that everyone should take into account when you're thinking about whether or not you want to reopen and how quickly you want to open your doors, because you really need to make sure that you're doing it in a thoughtful and safe way.
Yeah, no, I think that's key. So assuming you're reopening, I think there are kind of two big considerations, and then we'll break it down into a little more detail. But I think a critical consideration is, can you reopen and maintain social distancing? And that means, and social distancing is generally a 6-foot barrier. And that's an issue for both you as a manufacturer. If you're a plant, can you operate your plant in a way that does social distancing? And if not, are there ways to mitigate exposure? That's going to be the core question. And on the retail side, the question is, can you open and operate and maintain social distancing? And I'll talk about some furniture-specific options in a future slide, but I think that's really the question, because you may decide, even though I'm allowed to open, if I can't run the business in a way of social distancing, the prudent thing may be to remain closed. So let's talk about some of the considerations on the benefits to reopening. You want to kick us off with some of these, Sarah?
Sure. I think benefits to reopening or risk to not reopening, you sort of same thing, two different sides of the coin there, right? So obviously revenue, helping the economy, you're able to get people employed, people back to work more quickly, some productivity and innovation potentially, people being able to work together in an environment is sometimes more helpful. I think probably in this context, having the required tools and physical space and workspace is probably going to be a major consideration, and having access to the right equipment. Some of the jobs that you all may have at your facilities may not be things that could be done from home, like an office job could be. So I think that, those considerations might be a little bit different than you would have with someone who is working in like a retail store or at an office space.
I think that's very true. The other thing I would add, some of you may have applied for, maybe even gotten a PPP loan under the Paycheck Protection Program. If you do, you've got 8 weeks to spend that on payroll and other expenses once you get the money. So that's the other motivator. A lot of folks want to employ people. My only note there is you could potentially put those people back on your payroll and not formally reopen, right? There may be other jobs you can have people do. So don't assume that using the PPP money automatically means reopening, although that may be another incentive to do it. What about some of the downsides, Sarah, for reopening, or at least risks that you need to think about?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious ones, right, are people getting sick. So any of your employees getting sick, anyone coming onto your premises getting sick, contributing to overloading the health system or spreading the virus. I know most of you don't have customers generally coming onto your premises too often, but having negative press or reputational injury, if you are in a community that feels that it's too soon to go back, could be an issue. Although if you're in a community that feels like it's time to get back to work, the opposite could be an issue. So I think knowing your audience a little bit, knowing what kind of community you're in and where you're operating is really important. make sure that you have a good sense of what the public perception is. And I mean, your employees are probably the best people for you to listen to when it comes to that, because they're going to have a good sense of that in their own community. And, you know, some employees can be more productive at home, but if you're talking about like a distribution center or a manufacturing facility, that might not be the case, and it might not be possible for them to be working at home. So when you're thinking about the pros and cons, I think the most important thing is to just really focus on distilling down in a really thoughtful and deliberate way. What are the things that we are thinking about in this calculus of why are we going to reopen? Who is it critical that they have boots on the ground, and who could maybe do their job from home and stay there for a little bit of time? And writing those things down so that it's all documented and clear, so that your decision-making process is really crystal clear, and no ambiguity there for someone that would come along later and say, well, I don't understand why you kept this percentage of workers at home when this percentage of workers went back to work.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I think that documentation is important. I wanted to talk about some furniture-specific ideas. You know, and in retail, again, we don't have government guidance, and many of you may have seen this already, but La-Z-Boy submitted a letter to the administration as part of the urging to both have furniture declared an essential business, but also to be one of the first to reopen. And as you know, in several states, it's listed as an essential business. But I was struck by these, and I think we may have someone from La-Z-Boy on the call. So kudos if you're there, and welcome your input on it. But they delineated a number of things that I think, again, are good common sense protocols. This is not an area where a lawyer is going to say, oh, we have this, you know, guidance specific to your industry saying this is all the stuff you have to do. It's really a matter of trying to think through what the protocols are. But I thought I would share some of the La-Z-Boy protocols, because I thought they are good. They talked about, you know, having written protocols. I do think whatever your system is, and again, to Sarah's point on documentation, documenting how you're going to run either the store or the plant and what your safety protocols are and your cleaning protocols are really important. I'm not saying hourly is the magic number, although that seems like a reasonable number for retail stores where you have a fair amount of customer traffic. You may have a different protocol at a manufacturing facility. I think making hand sanitizer available and encouraging hygiene is key. You know, and focusing on high touch items, door handles and credit card terminals is great. For those of you that have been to grocery stores, many have implemented those kind of procedures already in my area, where they are using separate wipes or separate protocols to try to minimize contact. You know, temperature screening has been somewhat controversial in terms of how effective it is. We do have EEOC guidance that seems to suggest it is permissible to do temperature screening for employees. The biggest problem is, as you know, you can be transmitting the disease even when you're asymptomatic. So you may not have a temperature, you may not feel sick, but if you've been exposed, you can still do it. So it can create a false sense of security if people don't have it. But I think that's an option. You know, and I think social distancing is important too, in terms of reminding people to keep their distance, whether that is, you know, one-way aisles. Again, it's going to depend on your showroom and how you're set up. And I think no touching policy around greeting customers in terms of no handshakes, no hugs, or close contact also makes a lot of sense.
On the temperature screening point, I know that has been recommended by many different outlets, and it is a good thought. I want to raise, just as an issue that people can consider, that there could be some potential implications for privacy problems as an employer if you are screening your employees. For instance, if some of their health information was disclosed to other employees without their consent, you can run into HIPAA violations. If the employee feels like you are unduly screening them for no reason, you can run into discrimination type claims, especially if they're a member of a protected class. So some things that I have been recommending recently to some of my clients have been, especially if you're a large business, because you are a bigger litigation target for plaintiffs' attorneys, consider contracting with a third-party healthcare provider if you are planning on doing health screening checks. They can come up with a healthcare protocol. They can have a CNA or someone come who has healthcare training and do the checks for you with a set of guidelines that has been approved by someone that is not you. So if you run into any sort of snags with that, it should immunize you a little bit from liability down the road. And I know that that's an extra layer of cost for you, but depending on the size of your business, depending on the liability exposure that you have there, and that's something that a litigator could probably assess with you on the front end, it may be well worth your cost to avoid the litigation later.
I think that's a great tip. And we're doing a webinar on employee privacy issues on May 5th, and then a reopening employment considerations webinar on May 13th. I'll have that information in a later slide, and you can get it at our website. But those will both deal with some of those issues. And just as Sarah says, I think it's around privacy and what you're going to do, even though you may be allowed to test, who's going to do it, how are you going to use that information, are you going to share it? I think it's a lot to think about, and the idea of using an outside person makes a lot of sense. So that's a great tip, Sarah. Another area that a lot of people have been talking about, and this was part of a Lazy Boy letter as well, is limiting the number of guests in the store. And this is something that has been suggested at the retail level for a number of folks. In fact, there have been local ordinance that specify, sometimes it's tied, what I've seen is it's tied to occupancy. So it may say if your fire occupancy is 500, that it has to be no more than 50% of that or no more than 25% of that. The guidance that Lazy Boy used that I think may make sense for furniture showrooms is tied to square footage. And basically you see the range that they proposed around, square footage. So small stores with less than 7,500, maybe 5 customers at a time. And then as you get bigger, you allow larger groups of customers in for those larger showrooms. Again, and the math is not exact, but the idea is making sure that you can keep social distancing, not only between customers, but also counting your employees. So your showroom employees and customers should all be able to basically keep distance. And, is your showroom large enough that you can accommodate all that distancing? And again, I think the numbers here look like a reasonable rule of thumb. You may have to decide what the right capacity is for your particular showroom. But that's a good thing to consider. And again, check the local ordinance.
And let's be real, right? In some jobs and in some contexts, if you're at a warehouse, you're at a distribution center, you're at a manufacturing facility, you are not going to be able to always socially distance your employees. There may be times when, people have to work together physically in order to accomplish a task, and that's just the way that it is. In those situations, I would encourage you, identify those situations at the front end, right? Be like, okay, we have to be able to have 3 men load this giant piece onto this belt. That's a task that has to happen. We know that happens. We're going to identify that, and then we're going to say, we're going to take this step in order to mitigate the risk that's involved in that. So for those employees, we're going to provide them N95 masks while they're working in that task. And we're going to, provide those during their shift if they're working there, which is above the PPE that maybe you're providing for other workers in the facility. So documenting that you have identified those higher risk areas where social distancing is not practical, and then B, figuring out ways that you can practically mitigate those effects. And maybe it's not PPE, maybe it's something different. Will go a long way in limiting your liability down the road.
I think that's a great tip. And again, for those of you looking at your manufacturing plants, I just want to share some of the tips that we have worked with other manufacturing clients on, some of whom clearly are in essential businesses. So, one thing that people started at is looking at shift changes. So either changing shifts to reduce overlap, sometimes maybe running more shifts, going from 2 8-hour shifts to 4 6-hour shifts, for example, where you have fewer employees working each shift, so that there's less interchange and overlap. Again, to Sarah's point, sometimes you have to have multiple employees working on the same machine or doing the same piece. So it doesn't eliminate it, but the idea is you have less people crowded together. And then a lot of times they've been looking at bottlenecks or areas where people tend to congregate. So break rooms, for example, can be an area where you have a lack of social distancing if you get a bunch of people in a break room. So you can either close the break room or limited access to no more than 1 or 2 people at a time, or do something else. And obviously you have to have other considerations around employees and where they're going to do. But public spaces are other areas too where you may need to have stricter limits so that people don't just congregate where they might typically congregate before the job, after the job, or while they're waiting for some process to run. Because I think that's where you're most likely to run into some of those distance problems. And again, we know that there are times where you can't do the spacing. So the issue is what other accommodation. Again, I think most people first think about masks or gloves or other PPE, and that can certainly be an option. You can think about whether there are other viable options there where you simply can't keep that space. And it is a pretty plant-specific process. So I think we can't give you a one-size-fits-all that says this is going to be appropriate because I think you got to look at that process and think through. And again, to Sarah's point, we've heard it from both of us now, but I think documenting what that process is and what you've done to try to minimize close contact or minimize risk where there has to be close contact, I think then puts you in good stead to defend against claims. Let's talk through. I mean, again, none of us want to get sued, Sarah. What are the risks here for for people in the home furnishing industry that we think are the potential areas where those lawsuits could come?
Yeah, so first of all, take a look at the state return to work orders. So for instance, in Georgia, there is liability protection that's built into the governor's order, the executive order. Now, will it really protect you, and how far will that protection extend? TBD. We don't really know yet. And frankly, I think all of the things that we're telling you, I would tell you regardless of whether or not that liability protection is there. I think because we don't have any precedent showing how that executive order is going to be interpreted, I would encourage you to take all, reasonably prudent steps that are practicable and not too expensive to protect yourself and limit your liability. So the main areas of liability that the furniture industry is facing when returning to work for the consumer-facing businesses, obviously consumers getting sick or employees getting sick. For industrial manufacturing, it's mainly employees. And then for office-based companies, you've got employees getting sick or the clients of the business getting sick from being on the premises, or you even have third parties or vendors who would come in and potentially get sick as well. So those are generally going to be your liability exposure considerations, the primary ones.
Gotcha.
The types of claims that you could face as a business. So probably everyone's thinking workers' comp, right? Well, not everything's going to be covered under workers' comp. So you should be prepared and just be able to issue spot that you could potentially be on the hook. There was like a premises liability claim. So depending on who owns the building, depending on who the landlord is, a lot of times plaintiff's attorneys will just sue everyone. So you need to make sure that you have a well delineated plan as to what the property owner is doing in terms of cleaning, what you're doing in terms of cleaning if you're a tenant as opposed to the property owner, and make sure that that's all in writing so that when a lawsuit gets filed about who is supposed to keep things clean, you can say, I was going to do this, they were going to do that, and that's who should be the one that's in trouble, and hopefully that person isn't you.
Have there been some lawsuits that actually have been filed in the COVID context?
There's been some class actions that have been filed, but not for personal injury type claims, and then there's been some employment personal injury claims. I think there was a suit against Walmart by a employee there who contracted COVID and sued. So again, the bigger the company, the more likely that you're going to be seeing some personal injury type lawsuits. But hopefully if you can employ some of these tactics in order to try and limit your liability, you can avoid some of that.
That makes sense. No, and it is interesting. I think we will, plaintiffs' lawyers tend to be creative and they look at this as an opportunity. And obviously,
Yeah, for sure.
sadly, the risk, the damages if people end up getting COVID and dying, are significant. So those are the kind of things that unfortunately tend to,
They're
draw
certainly already
interest.
advertising for it.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
I think they're interested.
And I mean, we've listed on this slide, some theories of liability that could be alleged, but it's really fact dependent, but just some things to think about that they could raise if you didn't provide appropriate PPE to your employees or testing, or they were challenging the adequacy of the things that you did provide if you provide them, or we've already talked about the HIPAA or privacy issues with the screening or the cleanliness of the workplace. If you end up assuming a duty, so you take on a duty you wouldn't have otherwise had, and then you perform that duty negligently, they could sue you for that. So, it's a minefield out there. But, I think we're going to talk about this on the next slide, but the more that you can document your decision-making process, the more it will help you. And then I have on there for manufacturing companies in particular, I think you should keep in mind that you could have some product liability claims related to contaminated products potentially. And I haven't seen anything in the scientific literature yet relating to the virus staying on surfaces for a long enough period of time in order to get people sick. However, that could become an issue down the line. So if you are distributing products out of your manufacturing facility, you need to keep abreast of the scientific literature on that topic, I think, and make sure that you are following any recommended cleaning protocols for your products as they're leaving your control, because that's ripe for product liability claims coming at you, and you really don't want to get into that.
That sounds good. So if we decide to bite the bullet and reopen, despite the fact that plaintiffs' lawyers may be out there thinking about us, what are, can you summarize some of these best practices?
Yeah, so these are the big takeaways, I feel like. And the first is to plan, the second is to communicate, and the third, which we've been beating you over the head with, is to document. Right. So first, you want to plan and make sure that your workplace is totally prepared. And this goes into that should we reopen calculus, right? Make sure that you have planned exactly how everything is going to look, who is responsible for what, and document all of those decisions. And then a really good way that you can limit liability with your employees is just by communicating with them. Over communicating with them in this instance is encouraged. I think employees get more indignant if they have less information. So in this case, especially where it's an unprecedented time period, explaining the rationale for decisions that are being made, explaining why you're doing certain things is going to serve you well. And I know that there's sometimes a hesitancy on behalf of especially legal professionals to put things in writing in case they could be used against you later. But in this case, I think that something like that could be used in your favor later. It could be a piece of evidence that could say, look, we care about our employees. We wanted them to be in the loop. We gave them all of these communications leading up to, so they should have understood where we were coming from the whole time. And it documents our efforts to keep everyone safe.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And it's a critical point. So I
just want to touch on waivers real quick at the end before we move on to the environmental safety. Employee waivers are generally unenforceable, so you can't really get your employees to sign waivers if they come in. But if we're in some other type of business where it was client facing, those type of waivers, so if you go to a hairdresser or something like that, you might be seeing some of those waivers crop up as you, the client, to sign them. Those are enforceable, but on the end where you're a manufacturer and you're trying to get your employee to sign a waiver to work there, it's not going to be held enforceable. So that's not something that's going to be able to limit your liability.
So I wanted to touch on two other areas very briefly. And again, these are going to be topics of hour-long webinar. So we're going to, on May 6th, we've got one on environmental safety concerns. My partner, Brad DeVore, is going to be doing some of that presentation. But I think the things to think about really that this webinar will focus on are what do you have to do in the environment to make sure it's properly being cleaned and that you're addressing COVID. So it's part of it is industry guidance. It's, looking at different industries. Some of it is the CDC, which has issued some guidance on cleanliness and really thinking about those best practices. So, I think making sure things are cleaned, but what chemicals to use, how frequently to do it. I know Brad's got a cleaning expert that's going to be co-presenting with him. So we don't have all those answers, but if that's something you're focused on, I think that webinar on May 6th would be of interest. The other webinar I mentioned is one focused just on reopening and concerns around employment issues. My partner, Richard Rainey, I think is doing that. I think that's May 13th. And he's going to be talking about masks. I know I got a question we'll talk about in a minute about masks. We mentioned masks, but also things like temperatures, sick leave policies, furlough, and bringing people on, and a lot of detail, again, around the whole HR employment question. So these will be free webinars. You can sign up on our website. Also, if you go to the website, Womble Bond Dickinson, and go to the COVID link, you can actually sign up to get all our alerts. So you'll be alerted for webinars, a chance to sign up for them, and also some of the client-facing stuff. We've done over 50 different alerts in different industries and on different topics. So most of those are on the website, but you can also sign up to get some of those. I can talk a little bit about insurance, but let me pause because we did promise we'd leave some time for questions, and I have two already. If you haven't had a chance to submit it and you want to type one into the Q&A box, that would be great. I think we may have a few already, but I invite more. One question that we got early is it okay to only use masks when you're not in your workstation if the workstations are at least 6 feet apart? So I think this is someone that's got workstations that are 6 feet apart, but other areas that you're mixing around where you may come into contact with other employees. And I'll welcome your thoughts on it, Sarah. I think from the guidance I've read that as long as your workspace is one that has some social distancing, there's no rule that says you've got to have it there. Like if you're in an office or other isolated area, you may be able to take off the mask there. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. And again, put it in your policy. If you have people asking you, make it an across the board rule, right? Don't make exceptions for one individual. Say, if we're going to let people have their masks off when they're not within 6 feet working of other people, then that's what everybody does, and we're going to write it down so that it is a policy, because you don't want that one person to come back later and say, well, they let me do this, and it was the one exception that ends up getting sick, right? And then that becomes an issue later. So I would just say make sure that whatever you do is across the board. And also, it is important in these types of situations to, at least at a high level, keep track of what the guidelines are, right? If all of a sudden the CDC starts saying, actually, we were wrong about that whole 6 feet thing and it needs to be 20 feet, then we're going to have to reassess the guidelines, right? We're going to have to update your policy.
I think the other thing that people are struggling some with on masks is compliance. So you can have a policy, how much do you enforce it? To your point, you can't really, if you're going to have a policy, you just can't totally ignore it and then not do it. On the other hand, how strictly do you enforce it? That's also an area where I think if you say you should wear a mask, but someone's in their workstation not interacting with others and take it off because they're on the phone or they're eating a snack or it's just uncomfortable, you may decide to be lenient on enforcement, whereas it's different in a public space where they're with other people. And you may need to take a harsher action, for folks that are, wearing a mask in a situation where it's dangerous. But I think that's difficult. Something to think about ahead of time. You don't want to adopt policies that everyone just ignores or that management ignores, right? You need to set an example if everyone's going to wear masks. You're going to have your management folks wearing those masks. The second question we got in advance was around furloughs and protocols for bringing people off of furloughs. That is something I think that Richard's going to talk about in more detail. I know that, there's again a multi-part issue there. A number of people were furloughed with the idea they'd bring them back. Obviously, if you can bring everybody back, it's great. You may want to bring them back under the PPP if you got a PPP loan, because if you don't bring everyone back, you're going to get a reduction in the FTEs, which can reduce the loan forgiveness amount. I think the EOC concern, and there's some EOC guidance on furloughs, is that if you don't bring back everybody, but you're picking and choosing, you have to do it in a non-discriminatory way. So you have to have some standards, either based on certain jobs that are needed right now, or some other performance, or some reason to say, okay, we're going to bring back, the people in manufacturing line A, but not manufacturing line B because we don't have the supplies we need for B, or some other rationale. If you don't have any reason, you're opening yourselves up to some kind of claim of discrimination, that you only brought back the white employees or the young employees or the male employees or some other protected class. So you need to be thoughtful if it's a partial recall. And I think that's key. And obviously you may not be able to bring everybody back. Maybe they found another job. Maybe they're on unemployment. They don't want to come back yet because they're getting the extra $600 a week. You can certainly fill those positions with other people, but you need to have a uniform protocol for who is going to be invited back. And then if they don't accept that, how are you going to fill those empty spots? We just got another question asked a few minutes ago by Margarita. Thank you. It says, what if an employee does not want to return to work after your business is allowed to open? Can you terminate that employee? And I see you nodding, but what are your thoughts on that one?
I'm nodding because I'm anticipating that situation is going to arise. Some of the state orders have addressed this issue. I know that in Georgia, some of the order says that employees cannot be forced to go back to work. So check what the actual language of the orders is, and if there's any guidance. Usually there's like a explanatory document for businesses and for industry that will tell you in a little bit more of lay terms what you're dealing with. So look at that first of all and figure out what the landscape is, if it exists. If it doesn't exist, I am not an employment lawyer. However, I'm happy to riff on this. I think that if an employee doesn't want to return to work after your business is allowed to open, and you had given them every opportunity to work as safely as possible at your facility, and there is not a way that you can reasonably accommodate them in some way, so it's not a position where they could, work from home and be equally as productive, that I think that you do have grounds that you can terminate them. Now look at the employment laws in your state. Georgia's at will, so we can pretty much fire anyone for any reason at any time. But if you're in a different state that has different employment laws, you need to make sure that you know what those are.
No, I think that's right. And I think talking to an employment lawyer too, and I'm not one either. So our Richard Rainey, our presenter on May 13th, is an employment lawyer. I think it's important. The other caveat that I've heard them warn people about is if that employee is someone that's especially vulnerable, for example, to COVID-19 because they've got some prior health condition, or they're elderly, and you're in an environment where there is an increased risk of exposure, the issue becomes complicated around, do they have, an extra reason to not come in now, that it might be safe for 90% of your employees to come back, but someone that's elderly with a compromised immune system and heart disease and other stuff, it may be an unreasonable risk for them. And so that's the kind of particularized thing that I think working with your HR folks, working with lawyers could be difficult. Again, if it's a young, healthy person, that just doesn't want to come back and you reopened, you can probably terminate them. But I think you've going to have to check with the local authorities. And as they, if they could argue they're in a protected class or that they are at real risk in a way that other people aren't, it may require more detailed analysis.
And when we say protected class, for anyone that's not a lawyer that's on the phone, we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act protected class, which is age, sex, and its age is old age, age, sex, religion, national origin. What else is on there, guys? Is that all of it? Disability?
Yeah, disability.
Yeah.
I think
that's all of them.
I think that's most.
I'm showing my, I haven't taken the bar exam in 15 years.
I don't see another question here, but Michael and Andy, I wanted to see if you've got others.
Sure, Mark, I know, I'm looking at the attendee list. I know there's lots of questions out there, so use the Q&A function to type in. If they don't have an answer, they'll either point you to the future webinar where we got an expert, or we'll get an answer for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're happy to talk on the phone after the webinar or on a different day if you guys have questions that don't get answered here. And, you know, we're happy to speak with you privately too.
And I have advanced the slide. These are the webinars coming up that are of interest. And I'll very briefly touch on insurance just because it's an area I've been getting questions from a lot of my clients. Some of you may have business interruption insurance. You know, that may potentially cover you. There's been a lot of litigation already with no clear answer about whether policies that require physical damage to property, which is typically how business interruption policies are worded, apply in the context of COVID-19. So in other words, if you have a hailstorm or an earthquake or a tornado that destroys half your plant, business interruption is going to cover those lost profits for the fact that the plant was closed for 2 months. If COVID comes in and closes your plant for 2 months, it's less clear if it's covered. And I think that's an area where there's a lot of litigation, but certainly worth exploring your particular policy and looking at it. There are other policies that may apply. We've talked a lot in this call about liability. You may have commercial general liability for someone that visits and gets injured. Unfortunately, those often exclude viruses and bacteria unless you're in like a restaurant industry, which most of our home furnishers are not. So you may need to look carefully and don't just assume that your CGL covers everything because of these virus exclusions. And then again, we talked about workers' comp, and it would generally cover job site injuries, but there's questions around whether COVID-19 is a job site injury and whether there's other alternative avenues for liability. And then again, for those of you that are worried as directors and officers, you may have D&O coverage that would potentially defend you if you don't do the things that Sarah and I have been talking about in terms of creating a policy, thinking about employees, trying to protect safety. So that's a real quick snapshot of some of the coverage that is out there. And again, this is a list of some of the things. We've got another webinar coming up on insurance considerations. We got the ones I referenced. We have more liability issues that Sarah and some other folks are talking about.
You guys want to be more scared about how you can get sued.
More Sarah
Listen on Friday.
And we got some other people joining us there. We also have done a number of webinars on things like the supply chain disruptions, on the PPP program. It's not too late. They just put more money in if you think you're eligible. Those webinars talk through eligibility and other issues. So we've got quite a few resources out there. Michael, is there anything you wanted to add or questions you wanted to field? I know you introduced us and we haven't given you a chance to talk.
It's unusual. I don't get a chance to talk for 45 minutes in a row, but I'm sure everybody's pleased about that. No, I had nothing further. I think you covered the landscape. I would encourage everybody to please follow up on these issues that are coming up in more detail. That's really where the particulars of these delicate, narrow issues like employment considerations will be discussed in a lot more detail.
Mark and Sarah, can I ask you a question? You mentioned Walmart's being sued by an employee because they got sick. We're talking about the invisible enemy here. How does an employee point the finger at an employer for becoming exposed to the virus?
Yeah, so it's sort of like those negligence theories that I was talking about before. So the idea would be something along the lines of, you were negligent in allowing me to become exposed to the virus. So either you should have provided me protection from the virus, or you should have cleaned the facilities more carefully, or you unreasonably put me in too close a proximity to other people, or you knew someone was exposed that was positive and you didn't tell me perhaps, or I mean, it really depends on the facts of the situation, but those are all the gist, I think, of what you're going to see in terms of claims against the employers.
And Andy, to your point, it is often going to be very impossible to prove that they actually got the COVID-19 in the workspace, right? Because we have community spread in a lot of places. But that has not prevented, I think about, for example, some of the smoking litigation that's been filed. It's often, you may file a lawsuit claiming a certain exposure, and potentially, even if there are other sources of exposure, if you can prove negligence and a likelihood of exposure, you're not necessarily released to liability, even though you might have been able to get COVID-19 elsewhere. So it may not be a defense to say, well, it's possible you got it at the grocery store from a family member. There's going to be a fight and experts are going to come in. But if someone gives their opinion that they believe it's more likely than not, in their professional opinion, you got it at Walmart because they've looked at your other exposures and they were minimal, it may be allowed to go forward. Again, I would add to these, I'm interested in lawsuits. Sarah and I are both litigators, so we're following them. They're very early stage, so we don't know yet whether they're actually going to, what theories are going to be able to survive on, whether that gets kicked out at some kind of summary judgment. But unfortunately, it's expensive even if you end up winning it. So we're trying to cut those off. But I think that's the theory is, so you have to argue that it's more likely than not I got it at two things. More likely than not I got it at Walmart. And secondly, that Walmart failed to do what was reasonably necessary to.
So in civil litigation, I see one of these questions is, don't you need a burden of proof that someone was exposed at your facility? And that's sort of what we're talking about. In civil litigation, the burden of proof is a preponderance of the evidence, which just means, was it more likely than not that they got it there? So as opposed to what you see on TV with like Law and Order, where it's more beyond a reasonable doubt, where you have to really rule everything else out. In civil litigation, you just have to have an expert that comes up there and says, this is what happened. And as you all know from watching TV, you can pay doctors to say whatever you want. So it's not very hard for plaintiff's counsel to find people to support their theory generally. So yeah, these cases get further than you would think, unfortunately. And supplying employee masks. Yeah. Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was just going to read in case some people are just listening on the phone. Jeff Bassett had a couple of good questions about masks, basically saying, is it okay if they're non-N95 masks? What if they have their own masks, they made their own masks? I think that's a great question. We're certainly seeing a lot of that now as people are making their own masks and wearing their own masks. I'll give my 2 cents and then invite Sarah to chime in too. I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the job. I do think for general social distancing, what we are seeing, like in the governor of Delaware's order, just says a mask. It doesn't specify which kind. A lot of the courthouses I'm looking at just say a mask. I think for general stuff, for like your salesman and stuff, probably a regular mask. You can just specify a mask, and it doesn't matter that much whether they make it or buy a regular one. It doesn't have to be the N95. I think for heightened exposure tests, like the example Sarah gave of 2 people that have to work closely together in a manufacturing process, that's where you may want to think about something like an N95 or a better mask. Again, all masks help prevent that person from spreading the disease, meaning if you've got it, it prevents you from coughing as much or breathing on other people. It's not perfect, but most of the studies I've seen, and I'm not a medical expert either, seem to suggest that wearing it reduces the exposure to others. So you can protect customers and other employees some by wearing a mask. The N95s actually also do more to protect the wearer because they are screening out stuff that's down to the micron level, so the virus actually won't be breathed in on an N95 mask. So it's a different level of protection, but I haven't seen anything suggesting that everybody has to have it. And N95 masks, because they're used predominantly in the medical area, are often now harder to come by. Sarah?
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that at this point, based on the information that we have, I do not think that you should be requiring all of your employees to wear N95 masks. I think that the healthcare professionals need them more, and there is still a shortage going on. So I think unless you have a reason that your employees are going to be working in a higher risk environment, like someone who has to be working close together over a long period of time, I would say they shouldn't probably be wearing the N95 mask. I mean, if they have one and they want to bring it in, whatever, they can do that. But, I would encourage all of your employees to just wear regular masks. cloth. If they want to wear them, that's fine. If you want to supply them, I think that's fine too.
Andrew Polisek, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, asked about the Lazy Boy plan and said, mentioning Lazy Boy had a comprehensive virus safety plan, and can we share more details of the plan? I don't know all the details of the plan. I know that they submitted a letter to the White House talking about development of plans, and is that being a protocol? I've not actually studied the Lazy Boy plan. I think we may have someone from their safety group on the team. I welcome them if we can unmute them in some way, sharing it or sharing it later. So I don't know all the details of that. I've seen different companies' plans. Again, I think it should be company specific. The idea, the main goal is to develop, a plan that works for you. And I don't know if I don't know if the Lazy Boy, the full plan is publicly available.
Yeah, and if you're looking for examples, do some internet searching. Like Georgia's got the guidelines up for the minimum basic operations, and they really spell out in there, you need to clean things this many times. You need to have this many feet in between things. You need to think about cleaning high-touch surfaces like doorknobs, and they enumerate some things. So there are a lot of resources out there if you're looking for content to put into your protocols. And if you need additional resources, we have lots of those on hand as well.
Great.
Well, Mark, Sarah, Michael, we appreciate your time. Appreciate everybody taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. We will also be forwarding these invites with more details on these webinars to the entire membership. So, but feel free to get on the Womble Dickinson website, or we'll be sending that information out. So. Hope everybody learned something important from this, and good luck on your reopening process. That's our webinar for today. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Andy.
Thanks for having us.
Sharing it with us. Talk to you soon.